Welcome to our multi-faith webinar on rites of passage for people with disabilities. My name is Tom Jones, and I'm the Executive Director of the Faith Inclusion Network. The Faith Inclusion Network helps churches, helps other faith communities include people with disability so that they can experience the belonging that they deserve and the belonging to a faith family and to the God that they serve. And so today we have continued. We've continued a little bit on our series of multi-faith discussions, and we decided to tackle the topic of rites of passage. How does each faith how do they make sure that people with disabilities are included in the rites of passage? And so today, as we usually do, we have Muslim, Jewish, and Christian representatives. Today, we have Howard Blass is with us, Becca Marin Anderson, and we did schedule Sheikh Hassan Natur, but there was a death in his family, and he was not able to join us today. So we will keep him and his family in our prayers. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. First of all, this will be recorded and sent to everyone who registered for this webinar. There's also, we'll hear from Becca and Howard, and at the very end, we will open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have questions, just go ahead and put it in either in the Q&A box or the chat. And Rebecca Wolf will gather those questions at the end, and we'll get some answers from Becca and Howard. Right now, I will turn it over to Rebecca Wolf, who's our Interfaith Engagement and Faith Inclusion Coordinator for FIN. And Rebecca, you can take it away and introduce our guest.
Thanks, Tom. Well, welcome to Becca and Howard. Howard Blass serves as Senior Advisor for the National Ramah Tikva Network for the Ramah Jewish Camping Movement, and he's worked for over 40 years in various positions throughout the Ramah Disabilities Inclusion Network of camps. And he's also well known for leading trips to Israel. He's led 5 Tikva Ramah Israel trips and also served as a group leader for 6 birthright trips for autism spectrum disorder participants. So that's very unique. We may get to hear about that also. He is a social worker and a special education teacher by training. He teaches Jewish studies and also bar and bat mitzvah training preparation to many students with a range of disabilities. And he's also been working on a book, an anthology about disabilities. And that's soon to be published. I believe it is next year coming. Also, Howard, he writes many blogs and articles for both Jewish and secular publications. He's received numerous awards for disabilities inclusion and journalism, and he's involved with many disability inclusion organizations in the US and also Israel. And he has family in Israel as well, and is going to be moving there. So welcome, Howard. And next I will introduce Becca. Becca Marin Anderson is a disabled theologian, an activist, and a spiritual care provider. She began working with the Julian Way as an intern in 2022 and joined in her current role in the summer of 2022. She's been working in the field of disability ministry since 2016, with roles including co-chair of the United Church of Christ Disabilities Ministries Board co-founder and co-leader of the Disability Theology Discussion Group, and has also been a main speaker at the Institute on Theology and Disability Conference in 2023. To tell a little more about her work, she provides one-on-one spiritual care. She also coordinates community gatherings and oversees other pastoral care responsibilities. Something interesting is she co-hosts the Palsies with Palsies podcast. So we can share about that more too later. And she promotes disability justice within her own Christian denomination and beyond. She earned her Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary and is in the ordination process with United Church of Christ. So welcome to both of you. And I will turn it back to Tom to begin with some general questions.
We have such a varied experiences here on this panel, and I'm excited to hear from both of you. But because sometimes we may not be familiar with the rites of passage in different faiths, our first question would be, what are the rites of passage in the Christian faith there, Becca, and Howard in the Jewish faith?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Tom. So just a disclaimer, and I'm sure Howard would agree with this. All of our traditions are so incredibly diverse, right? And so today I'm going to specifically speak to my experience in the United Church of Christ. Because if I try to speak to all rites of passage in all Christian traditions, I will go on for a very long time and probably put my foot in my mouth. Um, and that is an interesting place to be because there are not a lot of very formal rites of passage in the UCC. But there are definitely a couple that come to mind as very important, and those are baptism and confirmation. So in our tradition, baptism is usually done when someone is an infant. Although if someone is not baptized as an infant, it can also happen later in life. And then confirmation is the process of as a teenager learning more about Christianity and about the United Church of Christ in more specifics, and confirming your baptism, affirming that this is what you believe and this is the place that you want to practice and live out your faith. So those are probably the two most formal rites that I can think of. But there are a couple other things that I want to make sure that we talk about today. And one is communion. In some Christian traditions, First Communion is a very particular thing. In the UCC, it's not nearly that formalized. Parents usually determine when a child begins receiving communion, but it is such an important part of Christian worship that I think it's important to talk about as a rite of passage in terms of being part of a community that if you don't have access to makes a significant difference. And the other thing that I want to talk about is taking on leadership roles, because in the UCC, as in a lot of traditions, being part of a church community isn't just showing up and being there. It's giving back and contributing to it and leading and volunteering. And so I want to think about that as a rite of passage today and how people with disabilities are given access to that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Becca. And I appreciate you mentioning some less formalized rites of passage as well as the formal ones there. And very, very much worth talking about. Howard, can you tell us a little bit about the Jewish faith and some of those rites of passage that you've participated in?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. So let me begin by saying thank you for including me, and that, I'll acknowledge, just like Becca said, it's kind of a big responsibility to speak for, I guess, 15.7 million Jewish people worldwide and 7.5 million in the United States, because there's, I guess what's the expression that we talk about when they talk about people with autism? They say when you know a person with autism, you know one person with autism. So I think if you extend that, it's sort of like our religions. If you know one person who's Jewish, there's such a wide range of observances and denominations and places that people come from. So I think that I'll try to get at some of the core things. I would say that when we talk about rites of passage, I'd say that we are a people with lots of rituals, right? Just in general. And even people who are less traditionally observant, they hold on to rituals, and at holiday time and in life cycle events. So I think I think that a lot of our holidays and a lot of our life cycle events have a lot of it's very multi-sensory in nature. We have a lot of objects and things that we touch and that we hold, and I think this oftentimes works really well for everybody, but also people with disabilities. If you think about, I'll definitely talk about rites of passage in a second, but just think about things like the Passover holiday. We have a Seder, and we have many different objects, and our holiday called Sukkot, which is tabernacles. We sit in these booths and we wave objects. So when it comes to life cycle events, I'm gonna put up a slide right now with a couple of sort of illustrate what we're talking about. I put up I have to say that Rebecca, I would have added something based on what you said in the introduction. I mean, you actually were talking about Israel trips, so I'll get to that in a second. But I would say that it starts off with birth and naming ceremonies. Very very common to receive a Hebrew name early on. A Jewish boy. This is would be considered biblical and has continued till today in the Jewish religion, that at 8 days old, a Jewish boy is traditionally circumcised. In Hebrew, it's called a brit, which is the Hebrew word for covenant. So it's when a boy officially enters the same covenant. And we would say, as anybody who knows this part of the Bible, that Abraham, the forefather, circumcised himself when he was in his 90s. And that has carried on till today, that we do circumcision at 8 days old. It's an obligation on the father, but most fathers are happy to turn that over to what's called a mohel, a ritual circumciser. It's quite common for people of all religions to undergo circumcision for boys, often in the hospital. But this usually takes place, it can take place in someone's home. That's the most common, with a highly trained person who's, like I said, a ritual circumcision person, a mohel. It could take place in the synagogue, and that person receives his Hebrew name. Now, a girl oftentimes has a baby naming ceremony. In the most traditional, the father would go to synagogue on the closest day when the Torah is read, and would be called up for an honor, and would then declare the baby's name. So that's for boys and girls. And that's pretty much it on the birth side. Not much happens in terms of life cycle events until age of 13. And it's very interesting. This is probably the area where I work in the most. As Rebecca Wolf said, I teach a lot of kids for bar mitzvah, almost exclusively children with some type of disabilities. And in the Jewish religion, it's very interesting. This when we get more specific about disabilities, the great thing is that one becomes a bar mitzvah. Everyone says, I had a bar mitzvah, I got bar mitzvah. Those are not really accurate. You would say that I became bar mitzvah. And what that means is that when you turn 12 for a girl and when you turn 13 for a boy, your status changes automatically. And again, I'll get into this in more detail. So it gives you the latitude to really mark that in a way that's personally meaningful, or whatever the learner is able to do. Um, in some cases, it involves coming up to the Torah, getting an honor, reading from the biblical scroll. In other cases, it's really just showing up. And I can get these in more detail, Tom. I put up wedding. I guess I'll insert in there, use your imagination, that Rebecca talked about Israel trips. And it's worth giving a plug for what's called Birthright Israel. And I mention this because in the Jewish, there's been a group of funders who have really taken it upon themselves to offer a free Israel trip to any Jewish person between the ages of 18 and 26. Sometimes it's up to 32. They now go up to age 50 when it comes to doing volunteer trips in Israel. And the idea is, it makes perfect sense that for all those years of religious school, when you weren't that happy, somehow going to Israel and seeing it in person in 10 days, suddenly all those Bible stories come to life, and all the things that you heard, it's much more tangible. So this organization, it's called Birthright Israel, has brought almost 900,000 Jewish people from all around the world to Israel for a 10-day meaningful trip. So I would put that up there as a rite of passage because it's offered to anyone. And again, we can talk about this more later, but where I'm connected to Birthright is that I lead a lot of disability trips, and I'll let you in on what should not at all be a secret. And I think that, unfortunately, the only criticism I have of Birthright is that they don't get the word out well enough, and I'm trying to help them, to the point that even rabbis and Jewish community leaders don't know this. But when they say this trip is for everybody, they mean it. Like when we talk about inclusion, they mean it. That if a person, I lead trips for people on the autism spectrum, trips for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are trips for people who are blind and deaf and dealing with substance abuse issues. So really, it's for everyone. And if I ask for extra support or accommodations, it's not a personal favor. It's really an accommodation for what's needed. So Rebecca, I would have forgotten about that. So thank you for even thinking about Birthright. I would call that a rite of passage. And then I guess, it's important to put marriage, because, I just went to a wedding in December of a former camper of mine who's 40, who married who has disabilities, who married someone else with a disability. And their married life will look a lot like many other people's married life, and it will have some differences in terms of support that they'll get from families and from community. But I think it's worth putting up there because it's not out of the question. It's not forbidden by Jewish law. It's certainly possible. And I put death. I mean, that's also part of things. Everybody's included in. The most important principle in Judaism when it comes to death. It's called, the Hebrew's called kavod hamet, means respect for the dead, and then you rush to take care of preparing a person for their burial, and it happens quickly because it's all out of respect for the person. The person's body is watched from death until they're buried as a sign of respect. Tom, do you want me to show the others, to say everything at once and show the other slides, or do you want to circle back and get into more detail about the other pieces? 'Cause I don't want to talk too much.
Okay, no, that's fine. Yeah, let's circle back to
Okay,
some of the other
perfect.
pieces there. Um, so I know that you've been very involved there, Howard, with people with disabilities and incorporating them into the Jewish faith and all the rituals. And Becca, I wondered if you could comment on how is your faith, or how the people in your faith, including people with disabilities, in the rites of passage, where sometimes maybe they weren't included. How are you making it possible for people with disabilities to participate in these rituals and these different aspects, different aspects of their lives?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the great advantages that I think the UCC has in this regard is we do not have a lot of hard and fast rules about anything. In the same way that Howard and I were both talking about the diversity of our overall traditions, the Jewish faith and Christian faith. It's also true that if you've met one UCC church, you've met one UCC church. They all do things pretty differently from one another. And so that can be tricky in some ways. But one of the ways in which I think it's really helpful for inclusion is there really isn't anything that someone can point to and say, because we are UCC, we have to do a rite of passage in this particular way, and that means that this person, because of their disability, can't be included. We just like people might have things that they could cite in the Bible that they could claim say that, but nothing that is from our denomination that really does that, and that has not historically been true of the Christian tradition overall. There have been a number of denominations that have had it as an official stance that people with disabilities cannot be leaders, and have had official statements about when and how and if people with disabilities can be confirmed or can receive communion. So I think it's a really great thing that we just don't have those. Yeah, of course, there are still a lot of challenges to inclusion that I'll get to in a minute. But things that we are doing, I think about advantages again of not having a one particular way of doing things. Baptism, unless a particular church has a specific way of doing baptism, it's likely to be pretty accessible to, at the very least, to the person receiving it. So, infant baptism, likely to be pretty accessible regardless of what disabilities you may or may not have. Adult baptism, because we're not requiring people to participate in a particular form of baptism, even if the church usually does immersion baptism and that's not going to work for someone, there's nothing that says we can't do, sprinkle water on the head or make the sign of the cross on someone's head. Similarly, for confirmation, there isn't a set, this person has to be able to articulate or express their faith in a particular way. It's if someone wants to be part of the church and be confirmed, then that is what happens. I again we'll get to when I talk about challenges, but there is typically a confirmation class leading up to confirmation that usually happens around age 13 or 14, and it's a year-long class to study and learn about Christianity and about the UCC and help young people discern whether or not they wish to be confirmed. And those very much can be accessible and are not always. In everything from are the physical spaces that they're being held in accessible to people of different kinds of embodiments, to does the curriculum take into account developmental and intellectual disabilities or different learning styles. And some communities are really on top of that and providing a lot of great access. Others are not. So that's both a plus and a minus. In terms of communion, once again, it's available to everyone. There's no rule of you have to be able to receive communion in this particular way, or you have to be able to understand it in this particular way. But there can and there are a lot of places that will put in a lot of effort to make sure that people can receive communion, because it is this very important part of our faith. But that doesn't necessarily happen in all places, and there are challenges to it that I'll get to. And in terms of leadership, I would say that a lot of churches will recognize that being a leader, being able to give back, being able to volunteer is part of what it means to be church. and that they need to offer those opportunities to people with disabilities as well, whether they're children or adults. And so in a lot of spaces, you will see that folks with disabilities are helping to lead worship or are helping out in various mission projects or soup kitchens or other sorts of church activities. I will say more about the ways in which that leadership sometimes operates that may or may not be fully accessible or fully inclusive. But it is definitely a pro that churches are thinking about that in a lot of cases. And I'm also glad, Howard, that you mentioned marriage and death, and I'll in order to not talk too long, I won't say too much about them. But similarly, like, there's not any restrictions saying like you can't perform a marriage of a disabled person, and funerals will happen in the same ways that they do. So that lack of strict requirements on things, I think really helps us out with accessibility.
I really loved how flexible your denomination is when it comes to participation, Becca, and that's a great way to approach it. To the general public, so I think maybe sometimes they have a more narrow view of prerequisites for faith and what that means as far as having more abilities to understand. And it's just sometimes it can be a narrow understanding. And Howard, I know you have overcome those in a lot of the things that you have done and participated in. And so I'd like to invite you to kind of circle back in some of those different ways that you have overcome some of those narrow understandings and provided instruction for people with disabilities in the Jewish faith.
Yeah. So I think, again, like Becca said, I think it's such a wide range. But I think that if you're looking for general principles, I think the guiding principle is that the starting point is that we'd all say that everybody is created in Hebrew, it's called B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image. So that's the starting point. So, if these are all, you look around you, and the reason that person looks like that or acts like that, it's not my call. And I don't know. I mean, that's just how we're all made differently. So, that you're sort of disrespecting your maker if you're not being inclusive and addressing those needs. Now, of course, that plays out very differently in different places. But there are some very strict understandings. Some people, look, I think the way it works in the Jewish religion, you have the Bible, and then you have rabbinic Judaism, which means that nobody's pretending to follow the Bible exactly as written. It's really through the eyes of the rabbinic tradition, which means that there are supposedly 613 laws, but they get played out and interpreted very, very differently over time. So there are some people who would say, oh, that according to this reading, a person with a disability couldn't be counted in a quorum or couldn't lead, but that's most people don't at all pay attention to that. I think that there aren't challenges when it comes to the birth and the naming. If you have the strict rule about circumcision on the 8th day, but you know what? If there's a medical reason, disability or not, if a person's born premature, they can't be circumcised on the 8th day. It could be the 30th day or the 60th day. So there's definitely, there's things taken into consideration. I think that the area that I know best is bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, the 12 and 13 year ritual. And I think that, I think we've made such great strides. I was thinking that it's a little bit analogous to camp. Like I've been working in a disabilities inclusion program within a typical Jewish camp. And it started in 1970, right? Which it's just extraordinary if you think about it, that people had this idea that people with disabilities should get to be part of camp. Of course, it was pushback. Very few people thought it should happen, but the people persevered and it happened. And, I think that nowadays, nobody questions that people with disabilities should get to go to camp. Whether a certain camp is the right camp because of the terrain or whatever, that's a different question. And I think similarly that, maybe years ago, people said, we don't do bar mitzvahs of disabilities in our synagogue. And no one says that anymore. I think the question is, well, educate me. What would it look like to do a bar mitzvah meaningfully for somebody who's deaf or someone who's a non-speaker? And these are all, these people exist. And as Rebecca said, I've been working for many, many years with a lot of colleagues on what's going to come out in February 2026 as like a guide for bar and bat mitzvah and disabilities. And it's really, we got a funder to help us get this book into the hands of like every rabbi in this country, because that's really the goal. So that if you're that rabbi or that educator and someone walks in your office and says, Rabbi, I want to do a bar mitzvah, my child is blind. The rabbi doesn't want to fall through the floor and say, what the heck am I supposed to do? But says, oh, there's actually 5 different things that I'm aware of. Let's talk about some options because you've read it before. And I think that's where we are. I think that people are thinking creatively. So I think that if you've ever gone to a bar mitzvah, you're probably likely to go to one on a Saturday morning. But there are so many more options, right? Whether it's Saturday afternoon where fewer people come, or a weekday morning when the Bible is read, or on a holiday. There are different venues. There's even if you're strict about Sabbath observance and you wouldn't allow technology, there are ways to do it on other days where you can use music and you can use microphones and you could use augmented communication devices. So I think that's really where I've seen challenges. But again, I think we're having conversations about details, like how will we get the person up onto the podium, so that it's seamless, right? If the person's not able to get up there easily, or many sort of small accommodations. I've been to bar mitzvahs where a person who has a lot of sensory issues is wearing shorts with elastic and a shirt because it's just not comfortable. And I think it's all about. I think the challenges are more, how do you bring the community around to understand that it's not it's not one size fits all. I think I was on a webinar recently with a lot of other people in the Jewish disabilities world, and again I'm still learning. I think that's probably important, that when you hear sometimes when people with disabilities speak about their experience, they'll talk about how just getting to the synagogue takes a lot of energy, right? And once you're there, make it easier for us, like somebody, and I guess heightening people's awareness about those people, whatever those looks like, that there are people out there, who's not coming, who's not in the door. That's really important. Somebody said that the timing of synagogue events, is not always so good. Because this is a woman as a professor, I rely on the help of a care provider, and they don't work after 7 o'clock, and they don't work on weekends. So she praised the use of Zoom for prayer services. And not every denomination would agree to do that on the Jewish Sabbath, but she talked. So it was just really compelling to hear the experience of the user. She said, I don't have arms and legs, and something, when they have the kiddush, where they have food afterwards, it'd be amazing if there was some provision set up that someone could help me. So I think that we're at any level, we're learning, whether it's the rabbi who for the first time is seeing a family who has a kid who's blind or deaf, or it's experienced people like us who are just being reminded of what we need to do. I think this past Saturday, I live in New Haven, Connecticut, and we have one of the premier disabilities programs, mostly autism, called Chapel Haven, right down the street from me. And some of the people I know from my camp program, others I've gotten to know the community. And I walked to synagogue with a young woman who I know from camp, and I brought to Israel before. And her experience was, she said, how come they don't announce the pages? And I said, you know what, that is a huge problem. This is not a disabilities problem. This is like an insider baseball problem. This is like so many of our institutions are set up as if everybody who goes there knows exactly what's about to happen. And when I looked at it from her perspective, we kind of talked through it. There's 2 books. Can you say, in the blue book, it's on page this, in the red book, it's on this book, and say it more often. Or some places have a page turner, a big sign with the pages. So I think the challenges they're easily fixable, and it's just about education. But I am proud of the fact that I think that in bar mitzvah we've really come a long way, and and I think, of course, people would say that yes, of course, this is important for the person and the family, but it's way more important for the synagogue community. That for them to see that people have strengths, not just weaknesses, and it really it's a communal celebration. And I think it heightens our awareness of it's a reminder that everybody is created in God's image. And there are a lot of people who look different or are different. So those are I think the challenges are really just that we have to keep doing more. But the other, I don't think that we have too many barriers around the other events. I'll just maybe I can just show you the this other slide. Um, I put this up here just to show sensitivity towards accessibility and kind of getting up onto the stage to lead prayers. And you know, there's one honor in the synagogue that involves taking the scroll, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, around. This wasn't, I don't think this was Rabbi, but that, you know, that a person could do that, even someone who's a wheelchair user or uses a scooter. I think some synagogues have designated spacing for people who have disabilities, whether it's augmented communication devices, there's amplification, there's larger print, there's magnifying strips. I think that it gives me a lot of pleasure to go to a synagogue and see that, you know, people have a lot of synagogues now have like a sensory room for if you have a child with autism. And invariably, you find not just little children there, you find their parents or you find other people, just people who need a break. So again, it's like the whole universal, design. So that's, and I'll just say one last thing. I just want to show that we have a ritual. It's called the mikvah. It's a ritual bath. Sometimes people use it. A woman may use it every month. Sometimes people use it when they convert to Judaism or for other reasons. And there are some in the country that have become fully accessible. It requires full immersion under the water for just a second, your whole body, for different reasons. And the rabbis have figured out ways to keep it within the bounds of Jewish law, but also to have a lift. So we're very proud of that. So just to give you a visual sense of some of the challenges and how we're overcoming them.
You certainly have shown a lot of different ways that you've made accommodations and for people with disabilities. And I really appreciate you mentioning that it's important, and I heard this at another webinar too, to understand some of the challenges outside of the synagogue and attending, that just being able to transportation, just being able to get there, the timing of some of the services, things like that. So there are a lot of different challenges. Accessibility, as you've shown here, is certainly one and the most obvious one. But we recently had a webinar on praying with Lear, and just very, very touching to see him as he in his bar mitzvah, and I think it kind of really lends itself to, I think, what you were talking about, Rebecca, as far as leadership and kind of visibility. It's important for us to see people with disabilities in leadership positions and in the participating in the rights that we have. So what do you see as, you've mentioned some challenges, and let me throw it back to you, Becca. What do you see as some of the challenges in the UCC denomination as far as the inclusion of people with disabilities in the life of the church and the congregation?
Okay, so this is where we put together a couple things that I've already said. We've got the lack of official requirements for how to do rites of passage, right? And then we've got the fact that every UCC church is different and unique from every other UCC church. And that's where we bring in often the challenge of local custom and tradition. There may not be a rule from the UCC that says you have to do it this way, but various communities will say, but we've always done it this way, and so we have to do it this way. And that can cause a lot of accessibility challenges. And I think the area of leadership is a particular one that a lot of, you might have like, well, the head of this board has always done this particular task that that person with a disability can't do. So I guess they just can't be in this leadership position. We've always done communion by going forward to receive from the rail, and like, maybe we can do something different for this person, but we're not going to change how we do this particular ritual to make that person feel more included. We've always used this confirmation curriculum, and even though it's not super accessible, we that's just what we've always done. Um, so you run into issues like that a lot. Um, and then I think the other main challenge is just lack of knowledge or lack of resources. So, a church may really want to make their confirmation service accessible, or their confirmation class accessible, and just don't have a curriculum that meets the needs of the people who want to take the class, or they don't have leaders who feel that they are trained or equipped to support students with various kinds of disabilities. And I think most often the response of a church in that situation is, okay, like we're gonna figure it out. Like, it's not gonna be perfect, but we're gonna do what we can to ask and to learn. But occasionally you do get communities that will say, we'll just kind of throw up their hands and say, like, we don't know what to do, we don't think we can. And that is a real challenge to inclusion, is this sense of accessibility is too hard, we can't do it. And so that's why this work of helping people to not just realize like concrete strategies of how things can be made accessible, but also the shift in mindset that leads to greater accessibility. And a lot of that is going to be decentering but things have always been done this way. Because the question that I ask if someone says that to me is, why have things always been done this way? Is there a compelling reason that really is important to the church, something to do with how they express their faith, or what the physical location means to them? Why is it done this way? Does anyone even remember? And if no one has a good answer to that, then why can't we change it? And even if someone does have a good answer to that, can we find a different way of doing things that still meets the same need, that still answers the reason that this practice was performed this way in the past? Can we find something that satisfies that same need, but is done in an accessible way? Um, so I think that those are kind of overall challenges that we see across these rites of passage. But I want to really return to the question of leadership, because I think this is one where a lot of churches have kind of these set roles that they can imagine disabled people filling. They can imagine people with various kinds of disabilities being in the choir, but can they imagine a disabled person being in the pulpit? Regardless of whether or not the pulpit is accessible, which it frequently is not, is that something that they have even considered could be a possibility? They might be able to imagine someone with intellectual or developmental disabilities helping out with coffee hour, but could they imagine that person chairing or co-chairing a committee or a task team? Like, these are the kinds of things where, like, oftentimes when people with disabilities are offered leadership, they are offered leadership in only some specific areas. And so I really want to challenge churches to think about, really stretch your notions of what these leadership positions could be, what they could look like, and challenge your notions of what you think disabled people are capable of, because chances are they're capable of a lot more than you have given them credit for.
Thank you, Becca. And Howard, just by the looks on your face, I think a lot of things that Rebecca said resonated with you.
Yeah, my list got longer. I thought I addressed everything, but you made me think a lot of the same things. Look, I was thinking that what are some of the challenges? Costs. Always. People. This isn't just about rituals, just in general. I think that when you start talking about accessibility, and people starting to think it's going to cost us $500,000 to take down that wall. Reminding people we're talking about a magnifying strip costs about $1 at the local dollar store. That there's something that's very small accommodations. I think I definitely think what you're talking about with leadership roles is huge. That's so important. That how many people with visible and invisible disabilities are on the steering committee or whatever the board or whatever it is, and that's really important as well. Um, I think that I'm thinking about the awareness of who's not in the building, who's not able to get here. I was thinking about this. My wife and I were talking about this. Our synagogue has a problem with low turnout just because of changing demographics. And I always think, who are the people? How do you get those people to come in? On days where you have no problem using transportation, like, would it be a good investment to just buy a van and just pick up people? It seems like it's so basic that some people just can't get there. And that would be such a good use of communal funds. I was thinking. I think we've made a lot of strides when it comes to education, but this is a huge one, like religious school education for people with disabilities. There have been organizations that have been around for like 25 years that are really addressing this, but I still think that it's hard to get it right because even if you do a good job with disabilities, there's so many different things under one roof. I mean, having someone who has cerebral palsy and someone who's blind and someone who has mental health, it's not the same thing. And I think that what's the model? How do you get the synagogue to own it? And so that's a big one. And I think the last one I just want to put out there is something I think about a lot is employment, right? That many years ago, I went to there was this big meeting. It was probably 20 years ago, and they were talking about employment of people with disabilities. And the head of the organization stood up and said, before we start getting on the case of the businesses in town or the big companies, how many of our organizations, how many of your synagogues, how many of your local Jewish federations hire people or make a big effort to hire people with disability? Let's start close to home. So, how many people in your church are saying, what, we have this job. We all know that there are a lot of people with disabilities who can do a heck of a good job with a lot of different things. And sometimes those are things that other people don't even want to be doing, but it makes them very happy to do the same thing over and over. I mean, this is just documented. There are industries who do very well hiring people who like to do the same task over and over again. So, how are we doing in that area? I mean, how is that a guiding principle? So you made me think about a lot of things I hadn't thought about. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I consider both of you visionaries and being able to see possibilities and for people with disabilities and kind of really be able to see what's needed. And I'd like to, the last question I'd like to ask you is, what is still needed? What do you see is still needed in your faith? And for Howard, I know you're working on the book. What do you hope that your book will accomplish uh, for faith leaders and people of the Jewish faith?
Well, I'll back up and I'll tell you the reason. This book was in my mind for like 20 years, and the reason for writing it was I said, when a family, and these are such dated notions. I had said back then, when a family makes their last trip down the aisle at Barnes and Noble looking for a book, but who does that anymore? As they go to the library. But that when you're about to give up, trying to figure out what to do for bar mitzvah for your kid, you came across that last book that told stories of like 5 families of kids with with Down syndrome. By the way, Tom, the co-author of the book is Alana Treckman, is the filmmaker for that book. She's my colleague, and it's actually quite interesting. It's all related. I'll tell you the backstory of how we met. I run this camp program and teach all these kids for bar mitzvah. And I begged the director to have her come to camp many years ago to show this movie on a day to the whole camp. And it was very successful. For those who don't know, it's about a young man who has Down syndrome. Now he's probably in his 40s, but you know, how he celebrated bar mitzvah, and he was very spiritual, and she was taken by his connection to prayer and everything. Well, we realized that we both had the same idea that I was teaching all these kids, and she would screen her film, and everybody would come up and say, "Let me tell you about my kid." And there were so many of those kids, right? Either success stories or families that were very upset that things didn't work out. So the idea of the book is to, could you present stories of people who have meaningfully figured it out, and clergy and communities who figured it out, and it would serve as a source of inspiration. Like it's like once something happens, it's out there, right? It's not like, if people do it, then it's how it's done. And I think that just to create those stories, and that if you're a clergy member and you read about what your colleague did or what what another synagogue did in San Diego and what they did in Minneapolis, it becomes really part of what's out there. So, to the point that it just becomes, you don't even need a book like that. Like everyone's doing it. I guess that's probably what you hope, that it doesn't become such a big deal, right? It doesn't become like when that movie about Lior, that was really an unusual story, like the kid with Down syndrome who did bar mitzvah, but everybody with Down syndrome does bar mitzvah now, just maybe look a little different and maybe different settings, but it's not such a big deal. Heads don't turn. I mean, people are moved by it, but it's expected. You wouldn't say, my 3 kids, except for the one with the disability, had bar mitzvah. It's just, they look different. One did more lines, one did it on a different day.
Okay. Thank you, Howard. And Becca, we'll ask you to respond, and then we'll move into some questions from the audience.
Yeah, no, I think there's so much opportunity for greater inclusion and accessibility, and I really resonate with what Howard is saying about providing resources and examples, and making this even more normal than it already is. I want churches to not always have to go into the panic mode place, that I think a lot of people do when someone shows up in their community with needs that they don't know how to meet right now. There's a lot of, oh God, what are we going to do? How do we support this person? Are we a bad church? Are we bad people if we can't figure it out? And so I do a lot of work, and I know Faith Inclusion Network does a lot of work, and lots of other spaces are doing a lot of work to provide communities and congregations with some of those possibilities and some of those answers. Um, and I think one thing that I think about a lot is, can we move away from a model of accommodation, a model of we'll change things when we have to a model of universal design and accessibility? And can we center people with disabilities in our congregations and our community and our rituals and our rites of passage? Can we build, as we're thinking about how to rework these things, can we think about as many needs as possible while we're doing that, so that we're not constantly adapting every time someone new shows up in our community? And obviously there's going to be a certain amount of that does need to happen, because you're not going to think of everything. But to the best of our ability, can we center people with disabilities in our work? And I'm currently working on a book project as well, with Dr. Rebecca Spurrier, that is about exactly that, about disability centering liturgy and prayer. And provides a lot of examples of personal devotional prayers, liturgy elements, and full liturgies for specific kinds of services that center disability. And a lot of the things that I talk about are in there, of communion and baptism and marriage, ways to center disability in the ways that a community does those things. So I think that is a really amazing opportunity that I'm so excited when I see congregations leaning into.
Thanks, Becca. Now, I think what we'll do now is I'll turn it over to Rebecca Wolf, and she will, I think she has a few questions from people who've been listening.
We do have a few questions, and I have a few questions myself. So first, thank you both so much. And we have a question. It can be considered a rite of passage, I think, about becoming a clergy. That's kind of a rite of passage. So the question is, what are you doing in your faith to support people with disabilities and specifically neurodivergent people in becoming clergy? That is the question.
Oh my gosh, such a great question. I nearly did talk more about this and ended up leaving it out. So thank you, whoever shared that, for bringing it up. This is frankly a big topic of conversation in the United Church of Christ right now. As Rebecca, as you mentioned in my bio, I previously served as the co-chair for the UCC Disabilities Ministries Board. And in that work, we are kind of one of the first places that disabled people in the ordination process go when they are having problems with the ordination process. And so because of that, we learned that there are a lot of problems. Again, because things are so different across the UCC, ordination is also very local. So someone's experience in Connecticut is going to be very different from someone's experience in Minnesota. And so sometimes in some with some committees, people with disabilities get through the ordination process very smoothly. Their gifts are recognized, their access needs are met. There are spaces that will celebrate neurodivergent clergy and really be cognizant of the ways in which they approach things differently, and that is going to be an asset in their ministry. However, there are also committees that ask people really inappropriate questions about the ways in which their disability will affect their ministry. There are committees that will impose additional requirements that people with disabilities be able to prove that they can do ministry in ways that they are not asking their non-disabled fellows to do. One example that sticks very with me a lot is there is someone who I know who is now a ordained disabled person, and is very much a disability activist and does a lot of disability activism work as part of her ministry. And someone on her committee asked her, if you are ordained, are you going to be a disabled person first or a minister first? To which the answer, of course, is neither. I'm both at once, always. But that is sometimes the response that disabled folks in the ordination process get when we are attempting to center our identities. So in terms of what's being done about it, the UCC Disabilities Ministries Board is currently working with the branches of our national setting that provide guidance to the ordaining bodies of the UCC, and we are putting together a manual that will provide information for committees on what are good questions to ask and what are not good questions to ask. What are the ways, and to help them bear in mind that disability is not just going to be challenges to ministry, it's going to bring assets to ministry as well. And so to really center that in their work. The UCC Disabilities Ministries Board is also a resource for anyone going through the ordination process. And we also have a national minister for disability and mental health justice who has been known to actually go with people to meet with their ordaining committees and serve as kind of a cultural ambassador to provide specific advocacy and education for the person in the ordination process and for the committee. So yes, this is definitely something that I think about a lot.
It sounds like there's a lot being done in your denomination. This is specific to UCC, right?
Yes, yeah. So I have somewhat less information about things happening in other denominations, but I do know that it is similar. That while a lot of as I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of denominations in the past have had very specific rules excluding people with disabilities from being in ministry. And a lot of denominations are removing those restrictions. So there aren't as many formal barriers to ordination, but there continue to be informal barriers to ordination. And I've heard this from colleagues in other denominations that there are just a lot of those really inappropriate questions. There are a lot of misunderstandings about the ways in which disability affects ministry. But also in many of those denominations, there are people working to address that. There are disabled people who are in ministry. There are lay leaders and allies, and there are a lot of movements that are working to support disabled and neurodivergent folks going through ordination processes.
Well, it's great to know that some of these, programs and resources are, developing, and maybe we can share even some of the ones you talked about if people are interested later. I do know in April we're having a panel with some autistic clergy. One is a pastor and one is a rabbi. So if people are interested about that topic, they can definitely join us in April. And I was told by the rabbi who's going to speak that there is a neurodiverse Jewish clergy group. So that was something I was not aware of. So more on that topic we will definitely have. I just want to get to another question.
Can I say something about that topic? I think that it's,
Yes.
especially in the Jewish religion, I think that there's so many different, I think it probably varies by rabbinical school, and different denominations have different strictures. I think that the more liberal denominations are more, they don't have to get through a rigid curriculum in the same way that others do. And I think it's more open to it. I think that they struggle with that, right? I think that I could tell you anecdotally, I'm sure there are plenty of clergy members, plenty of rabbis who are neurodivergent. That's just a fact. You would expect that in anything, whatever, 1 in 5, whatever it is going to be across any people, across any profession. I'm sure, I know that for sure. I think that sometimes people only discover, I've heard this a lot about undiagnosed learning disabilities, that the first time someone realizes that they have a learning disability is in rabbinical school when you're studying a higher level Hebrew and you just can't do it. I've heard this has made a lot. This happens quite often. Not quite often. It happens, right? And then what do you do with that? And what's your path forward? Because you always felt smart and knew you were smart, and suddenly you don't feel very smart at all because you can't get through your Hebrew requirements. So I think that this definitely comes up, and I know that that institutions are struggling, considering, how far can what is an accommodation versus what are their core requirements. And I think that's really, it's tricky. I'm not obviously, and I think it's the same like with it's like with the technology I said before. Some denominations are able to have no problem saying that by all means do it on Zoom, and others can't permit that because of Sabbath. I think it does, just because you can't find a way forward doesn't mean you're not struggling and doing as much as you can and being sensitive. I think that it's, I think it's complicated. I mean, nobody's starting point is how do we keep people like that out. I don't mean people. I don't know if there's an active recruiting campaign. But I will also say that I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is like in other religions, but it's been well documented that the number of people applying to become rabbis across all the denominations has gone way, way, way down. It's very low. So, of the 5 candidates for rabbinical school in that year, how many, maybe one, so I just think that's important to keep in mind also that there are bigger conversations. I'm not to take away from this important conversation, but I think that how do you even sustain training any clergy has become huge. I don't know if that's the case in other religions, but certainly in the Jewish religion, it's just, if you want to become, if you want to go to business school 2 years later, you walk away with an MBA. You want to go to law school 3 years later, go to medical school, but it could take 5 or 6 or 7 years to become a rabbi, and then you don't have any job security because you're an employee of this of the establishment. If they don't renew your contract, you're going from point A to point Z with your family, and that's hard. That's hard. So I'm just bringing that up as a bigger context.
Um, it, Howard, do you think that people with different types of disabilities are like a little put off from trying to,
No, I don't know. I mean, maybe the requirements seem daunting and maybe it's not made clear. I guess, maybe I don't, like I know that like when you're trying to help a synagogue become more inclusive and get the message out, you always say that if your website says, if you need accommodations, here's the person to call. So it's a very inviting thing. And so the person who's deaf suddenly finds out actually there's a place for me, right? So I don't know how many rabbinical schools are putting on their website, open for people who are neurodivergent, but I think that if they ask the question, then it sort of forces it. But I don't think people are, I don't think they have this big. It's a good question. I mean, whether you feel like there's even a place, you wouldn't know if there's a place for you because there's no sign that says, "Welcome, come in, whatever you look like, or whatever you learn, or whatever accommodations you need." That's a good question. I don't know.
that would be an interesting thing for some of the rabbinic centers to put more clearly, perhaps.
Yeah, good thought.
Um, Actually, I have a question for you, Howard, before we get to the other attendees' question about for the bar mitzvah training. I was curious if you could talk a little about different types of accommodations or adjustments that you make, like for different types of disabilities, like you said about different learning differences, or have you worked with those who are deaf or blind, or what
Yeah,
kind of thing?
it's a great question. I mean, look, I think I'll give you just a sense. I could have showed slides about how to prepare this, but like, I mean, for in a lot of the minimum or sort of the accepted standard, though it's not required, is that somebody learns how to say the blessings before and after a section of the biblical scroll is read, and also to read from the scroll. And that could be hard for a lot of people if you're blind, if you're deaf, if you have a learning disability. And I think that what I try to do is do whatever it takes to get to that point, and to say that people have different strengths. And I mean, sometimes learners make the teachers look great. Like I've had parents who say, "Oh my goodness, if I can only learn 3 lines, it would be a miracle." And it turns out the kid has and because of the kid's language-based learning disability, it turns out the kid has perfect pitch and has like an incredible auditory memory. And I could have just like made a tape and come back in 3 months. They would have learned everything. And then what a great teacher. I said, kidding? We didn't, and I think that's really kind of help teaching teachers to be a little more flexible in how they do it. So I'll sort of engage kids and say, are you the kind of kid who, when you're getting dressed in the morning and the music's in the background, all the words some will get in your head without even trying? Are you a kid who likes to do puzzle? Sort of figure out, are they more visual? Are they more, and then kind of move in that direction? Because the end point, if there's a lot of ways to get to the end point. You know what I mean? And you can work backwards. And I think, like, I've even seen, obviously you're supposed to look at the Hebrew, but I've had people, even the most traditional, who say this is an accommodation. They could look at the English, or they could do it a different way. And I think there's no, it's all equal. Like you don't get like a higher level. It's not like you're Phi Beta Kappa, or you graduate with distinction. Like it's all the same. So whether you do 3 lines or 150 lines, it's all bar mitzvah, right? And I guess what I've done, I'll give you a million just examples off the top of my head. I think you could in this book, we have a chapter about the speech, right? So imagine that your task is to teach something about the biblical portion and find some meaning in it, okay, and share it with the audience. Call it a sermon, a homily, a devar Torah, words of Torah. Well, one way the accepted way is you stand up in front of the group and you talk. Well, like some people say, the goal is to teach Torah, is to give it, but for some people, it's like a one-woman comedy routine, or it's a PowerPoint, or it's an artistic interpretation. So to sort of move to show different options, right? Um, I worked with a girl who was very smart, had a lot of learning disabilities, and had a lot of social anxiety, but she was very artistic. And the parents created like a cocktail party, like an art gallery opening. Instead of her having to say a word, all of her artwork was up on easels and it was captioned. So she didn't have to do anything. I worked with a boy recently, and he basically, his talk was, he's not going to give a talk. So we spent months working on a PowerPoint presentation. Working, I mean, he recorded it, he videotaped it. So his job on the day, well, the next day on the Sunday, was to push play on the computer, and everybody watched his 10-minute speech, and it was great. So just trying to think creative. I mean, it's not so complicated. It's just a matter of being willing to think in different directions, and sometimes it's not even, it can be changing the setting. I work with someone where they just rented out a summer camp, and it was like a destination wedding, but for a bar mitzvah, so that after everybody's been like zip lining and swimming, and then you get to the bar mitzvah, like what's there to be nervous about? You know what I mean? So it just kind of breaks the ice, and he was driving all the guests in the golf cart from the parking lot to the bar mitzvah. So it's kind of like de-emphasizing like the moment, not making it so it's like this moment where all eyes are on, and it's like, or like whatever. Those are a few off the top of my head. It could be changing the setting. I mean, some people, it could be doing it in your at your beach house on the beach, or it could be doing it in your backyard, or it could be, that happened a lot during COVID. It could be going, taking the small group of people to Israel or someplace that's really special. So read the book. It's gonna. I mean, like, the thing is, what I was gonna say is, I think when this book comes out, Tom, I think I'd love to we should figure out if we can get people like you to write a blurb, because I can imagine that everything except for the actual thing in the service is widely applicable, because like Tom asked me in a recent meeting, like kind of how I got to this organization, and I said it was really watching a webinar. I mean, I'm very happy that Becca's here, but I remember it was really an imam that kind of opened my eyes. Like during COVID, we were watching this webinar, and it was an imam talking about mosque accessibility, and I thought, wait a minute, like of course, like of course there are people like in our synagogue, but in your mosque and in your church, and like that's why we have this organization. Is that so? I think that if you're trying to teach people to do something for a life cycle event, and we have a whole book about people who are deaf and blind and whatever mobility challenges, there's probably something in there for you, even if it's called bar mitzvah. So, well, but I hope that answers your question. It's off the top.
Oh, those are great examples. That was going to be my next question about, specific examples of unique or memorable bar mitzvahs. So one is changing the setting outside the synagogue, because it can be, the synagogue could be, limited with the space or what you can do, and so you can bring the Torah outside as well.
Yeah, you could even rent a Torah. You could do, there are a lot of different things that people do. Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned art. You can do things with visual, audio.
We have a chapter in the book about bar mitzvahs in summer camps, like either renting out the camp. Again, if you're doing something and people are wearing shorts and a t-shirt and flip-flops and under a tree or by the lake, it just takes so much of that angst, the formality. You can still be very respectful. Look, in Israel, nobody wears suits and ties. It's a hot climate. So many religious men will go to synagogue wearing sandals and a white button-down shirt and blue pants. It's not, no ties, no jackets. So it doesn't take away from the seriousness because you dress a certain way. You could respectfully wear a collared shirt and shorts, and it does take, just kind of taking those pieces out of it. I mean, there's so many examples I can think of, but the camp, the environment is definitely one of them. There's a holiday that we had called Purim, where we read the Esther story, and it's essentially everybody gets dressed up in costumes. So imagine having your bat mitzvah dressed up in costume. Where this, I remember the girl's father, the so-called rabbi came out wearing like a full garb of a Hasidic rabbi, and it turned out it was the girl's father. It just set the tone for like this very playful night where everything goes. It's like everything gets, how could you be nervous about your thing when your father just looks like a rabbi, your mother's a clown or a cat or whatever. You think there are ways to be sensitive to take those things into consideration and also to make it modified. I mean, a lot of sometimes like I'm very happy to make the service 45 minutes instead of 3 hours. Just do the essential things, and you know, those are some ideas. But this is anybody wants to talk about this further. This is a topic that I love, so I'm happy to talk more.
Wow, I've never heard of having a costume, costume theme.
Yeah, it's possible, right?
But just so people know, who are not familiar, yeah, the bar mitzvah is usually a very a formalized, ritualized type of ceremony. So, fancy clothes. There's a very formal structure to the service. So just to give people a context, right? Um, and Becca, I wanted to ask, are there any specific examples of memorable, communion, confirmation, anything that you remember that was unique that stood out to you?
Um, Trying to think it through because I mean, I again like I think in the use like I don't know that I have personally experienced too many things as awesome and creative as what Howard just described. Um, but like I've definitely I think it's definitely really a wonderful thing when you can really tell by how a service or an event is being carried out, that disability was very much at the center of it. I can definitely think of a couple of weddings that have really been that way, when discussion of access practices was really well grounded, and people were really orienting folks to what was in the bulletin for people who might not be as familiar with the tradition. Um, I think about communion and the ways in which like there are so many different ways to do it, and the times when people don't like I think one thing that I see a lot in communion is people assuming that somebody wants to stay in their pew and have communion brought to them. Um, and some people may prefer that, but for other people, that's a very othering and distancing thing of everybody else is going forward to receive communion and I'm not. And so as a blind person, I've always really appreciated the communion services where the first response is not, oh, stay here, I'll bring it to you. The first response is, what would you like? Do you want to go forward with me? What would be helpful? And so yeah, I think that I am sure there are lots of really creative ways that people have done confirmation classes. It has been a long time since I did confirmation class, and that is not something that I lead personally, but I am sure that there are just so many amazing ways to present material and to invite young people to engage in that material. And then the actual confirmation service in the UCC is usually pretty simple. But does sometimes involve the youth who are being confirmed leading a worship service. And so I could definitely imagine some really creative ways for people to contribute to and participate in that.
Okay, we have time for one other question before we have to close. And from Rabbi Levy, his question is, after after the rituals that people go through, for example, the bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs, or the confirmation, uh, or an adult baptism, a believer's baptism, or First Communion. After some of these rites, is there any training or instruction on the responsibilities that these carry after the actual ritual? Just so that people get a better understanding or continue their understanding of what it means to a person of the Christian faith or Jewish faith.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good question. It is something that I think about a good bit in this in a similar way that I was talking about, leadership roles and congregations not always uh, imagining disabled people in certain kinds of leadership. I do think there can sometimes be a like, and this, pointing at a higher point, kind of at my head level, this is the point that we expect non-disabled people to participate at, the level of commitment and responsibility that we expect. And this, a little bit lower down, is what we expect of disabled people. And it really bothers me. It really bothers me that if someone there are times where like someone may be not treating another member of the congregation well, and the response is, oh well, that person has X, Y, and Z disability or mental illness, and they just can't help it. And it's like, that, but that's not, they're not showing love to their neighbor right now, and maybe they need a different way of that being explained to them, or support in living that out. But that doesn't mean that we just say, oh, you get to act out your faith in a totally different way that we would not consider acceptable from someone else. I think like sometimes there can be some confusion between access and flexibility, and letting people off the hook for their responsibilities as being part of a community. Um, and I think that is definitely a growing edge for a lot of Christian spaces, because there in the UCC there isn't really that much continuing adult education in general. There are Bible studies, and there are occasional classes or discussion series for people to continue to learn and grow, and those are often not accessibility is not centered in the way that it is for the classes aimed at kids. So that's something that I would definitely love to see changed, is just expecting more in a positive community belonging way from disabled folks, but also support and access to the education opportunities and opportunities for deepening faith that are available to other members of the community.
When I hear your question, I can think of a couple of things. Like I don't know if maybe you're talking about kind of like retention in general, like post bar mitzvah. This is a huge issue. I mean, a lot of times families just kind of use they stay members to get through that life cycle event, and then it's see ya. They don't, and I think it's an important question of why do people leave, and how do you retain them? And I think that again, when you're talking, I was thinking that in Hebrew there's a lot of different words for synagogue, and one is a beit tefillah, the house of prayer. But that's not but the main word is called a beit knesset, a house of gathering. And I think some people will come and gather because if prayer speaks to you, knock yourself out and pray as much as you want. But there are that for some people it's doing the community service. And I think that just finding those different opportunities. I mean, for some people, high level text learning is not gonna, you don't have to have a disability to have that not be your thing. Or maybe it is your thing, even if you have a disability. There's a blind young woman who is a tremendous scholar who's about to go off to Israel and study for the year in a very high level learning environment. So that, but other people may not be, that might not be their thing. But if you're making sandwiches for people who are needy in your community, that could be just the right thing. So he's just creating these multiple pathways and making sure people have ways to get there. And they're being just having someone who's watching those people around the edges. I mean, like look, there are some like after a synagogue service, a lot of times there's some type of food, kiddush, kolish, whatever you call it. And I think if you watch a great rabbi in action, that rabbi is not eating. That rabbi is watching and engaging people and seeing who's off to the side. Not to mention the people who aren't even in the building. I think that's really important to figure out. Like our friend Shelley Christians always talks about that. It's not just about it's about belonging. I mean, do you feel there's a place for you to belong? It's not just can you get in the building, but what's going to keep you there? Are people going to notice if you're not there? Like that's important. And if that's the case, you're likely to be there because you don't want to let your friends down and you want to see your friends and everything. So
Okay. Thank you, Howard. This has been a fascinating discussion and so rich. And I want to thank Howard Blass, and Becca Marin Anderson for talking and sharing your thoughts, your ideas, your experiences with us. Um, we appreciate you being on this panel, and I just want to, before we close, we'll tell you that it's being recorded and will be distributed to everybody. Just a few more things that are coming up. Next week, March 27th, we'll have a multi-faith panel on young adults with disabilities. What are some of their needs and some of the ways that we reach out to them? April 2nd, as Rebecca mentioned, we'll have Lamar Hardwick and Rabbi Seema Yora, who will talk about their experiences as faith leaders who have autism. April 8th, we'll have Voices of Young Adults. And then April 10th, we'll have a multi-faith webinar on sibling support. How can we support the siblings of people with disabilities, and what's being done, what can be done? So thank you again, Howard and Becca.
thank
Thank
you.
you. I want to thank everybody who's been participating in our audience. And Rebecca, thank you for your questions and introductions today. And we look forward to many more discussions, multi-faith discussions, and hope you'll join us then and keep in touch. God bless you all for all the work that you're doing.
Sure.
Hope you'll take care, and we will be continuing to talk with you more.
Thank you, Tom.
Good job. Thank you, everyone.